Welcome to the debate. When a building collapses, our immediate instinct is to look for the wrecking ball. We scan the rubble for signs of an explosion, a fire, to some obvious violent event that brought the whole structure down.
Right. Yeah, we are practically hardwired to look for the villain holding the dynamite, It makes the disaster legible. It gives us a really clear cause and effect.
Exactly. But, any structural engineer will tell you that the most devastating collapses rarely start with dynamite. They usually start like 100 years earlier. They start with a draftsman sitting at a quiet desk, erasing a load-bearing wall from a blueprint, simply because it saved a few dollars on materials.
Right, and that draftsman goes home, eats a totally normal dinner with his family, and sleeps perfectly well.
While the foundation slowly, imperceptibly rots. And that invisible, quiet engineering is the exact tension at the heart of the text we are examining today. That is Robert Walker's They Slept Soundly, The Architecture of White Supremacy.
It's a heavy book.
It really is. Walker documents a 400-year-old system that continuously adapts its delivery mechanisms, right? From 19th century skull measurements to 20th century textbook editing, all the way to 21st century Discord servers. And it does all this to perpetuate racial hierarchy.
Yeah, but the central question we're debating today is how we should actually interpret the mechanics of that history.
Precisely. Does Walker's conceptualization of white supremacy as an autonomous, self-perpetuating, architecture operated by decent professionals actually capture how systemic inequality actually works?
Or does this framework risk obscuring individual moral agency? Does it flatten disparate historical and economic motives into a single omnipotent machine that ultimately lets bad actors off the hook?
Well, I take the position that Walker's structural framing is profoundly accurate. I'll be arguing that the endurance of white supremacy relies precisely on bureaucratic neutrality and the absence of individual malice, making the architecture itself the primary engine of inequality.
And I represent the perspective that while systemic forces are absolutely undeniable, defining 4 centuries of distinct economic, political, and personal actions as a singular architecture risks over-ascribing intentionality to the system. It basically minimizes the active, conscious choices of its individual operators.
It requires the absence of hate to function efficiently.
Wait, requires it?
Yeah, requires it. When you look at the operators Walker highlights, men like Gerald Hoffman drawing federal redlining maps for the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1936, they weren't acting out of malice. They simply followed the standard methodologies of their fields.
Well,
the architecture survives because it is built into the actuarial risk assessments, the editorial guidelines, the market demands of American institutions.
I approach this from a very different angle. Walker's framework is undeniably compelling, but I think it is conceptually overbroad. He labels everything from 17th century Virginia colonial property law to Warren Caldwell's 1968 political strategy memos to a modern Roblox historical battle simulator as the exact same architecture.
Because the function is the same.
But by doing that, the text risks flattening highly distinct historical motivations into a predetermined teleology. And by predetermined teleology, I mean you're basically saying the system knew what the end goal was centuries before it happened. Which honestly gives a mindless system way too much credit. Framing these events as the outputs of a faceless, self-perpetuating system provides an intellectual alibi. It diminishes the active, conscious, moral failures of specific individuals who chose to build those systems.
I hear you, but you're assuming the people operating this machine actually recognize what they were building as a moral failure. If we look at the textbook editors Walker highlights, the mechanics of how this worked are entirely narco-driven.
You're talking about the Boston example?
Yeah, take Arthur Pennington in Boston in 1905, and then Patrick Gannon in the 1920s. Pennington literally removes an image of an enslaved family from a manuscript and replaces it with a hagiographic portrait of Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
And Gannon takes a chapter that explicitly mentions the 16 black congressmen who served during Reconstruction, changes the number to just some, and frames the entire era as one of misrule.
Right. Which is just a horrific erasure of history.
It is. But look at the how and the why. Gannon didn't just wake up and decide to erase black congressmen out of personal animosity. He was dealing with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC.
The measuring rod rubric?
Exactly. They essentially had a monopoly on textbook purchasing boards across the South. They published a rubric called the measuring rod. If a publisher's textbook didn't adhere strictly to those pro-Confederate guidelines, that publisher was completely locked out of the Southern market.
So he just caved to the pressure.
Well, Gannon was looking at a spreadsheet where historical accuracy equaled bankruptcy. Walker's point is that Gannon did this to maintain a 62% market share. The system operated through pure market forces. These were, quote-unquote, decent men serving a bureaucratic demand.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I understand the appeal of blaming a faceless market, but I can't accept that premise because it totally strips these men of their agency. Gannon wasn't a passive victim of the market. He was an active, willing participant in a lie.
But a financially motivated lie, not an ideological one.
Does it matter? He made an active, conscious choice to prioritize profit over historical truth. I mean, he deliberately erased the 180,000 black Union soldiers who fought in the Civil War. He erased the Hamburg Massacre of 1876, where a white mob slaughtered black citizens in South Carolina.
Right. I'm not denying the impact.
But calling it the market or the architecture obscures the fact that these were profound individual moral failures. Look at the specific detail Walker includes, you know? Gannon actually wrote in the margins of a manuscript regarding the suffering of freedmen. He wrote, "The student does not need to dwell here."
Yeah, I remember that margin note.
That is a deliberate editorial choice to silence history. You can't just blame an abstract architecture for a pencil stroke made by a man who knew exactly what he was erasing.
I see the hesitation to let them off the hook. I really do. But let me offer a different perspective using one of Walker's earlier examples. Let's look at Dr. Elias Whitfield in 1839.
The skull measurements?
Right. Whitfield was an assistant measuring cranial volume for the famous anatomist Dr. Samuel Morton. The methodology was to pour mustard seeds into a human skull, then pour the seeds into a graduated cylinder to measure the brain capacity.
Which was the standard accepted science of the day.
Exactly. And Whitfield kept a meticulously detailed ledger. It had columns for race, for sex, and for cubic inches. But it had no column for the humanity, the family, or the history of Specimen 47, who, we now know was a living, breathing woman from Charleston named Abeni.
A horrific reduction of a human life to a single data point.
Exactly. But think about the mechanics of his job. If you're an accountant using a spreadsheet that physically lacks a column for human suffering, your final report will inevitably erase human suffering.
Okay, but
the danger isn't that the accountant is evil. The danger is that the software makes it impossible for them to factor in humanity even if they want it to. If the professional tools themselves are engineered to erase humanity, how can we expect the operator to transcend the architecture?
I see what you're saying.
Whitfield was doing his job exactly as the scientific institution of his day designed it. The erasure wasn't a personal moral failing in his eyes, it was a methodological requirement. The architecture forces the outcome.
But the software designer, in your analogy, is just another human being making choices. I mean, Samuel Morton made choices to design that ledger. Patrick Gannon made choices to erase those congressmen.
Sure, someone designs the tools initially.
Right, so when we say the tools are engineered to erase humanity, we still have to hold the engineers accountable. The profound danger of Walker's framework is that it creates this massive diffusion of responsibility.
How so?
Because everyone is just a clerk, just an editor, just an appraiser filling out forms dictated by someone else. It risks turning history into a giant Rube Goldberg machine where no one is actually at the controls.
But that is exactly how systemic inequality operates. It is a machine. And if we want to understand its immense power, we have to look at how that machine updates its delivery mechanisms across centuries while preserving the exact same outcome. Walker calls this the abstraction ladder.
Right, the shifting vocabulary of the system.
Exactly. The system survives by constantly updating its vocabulary to remain socially acceptable. It moves from explicit theological justification in the 19th century, like Reverend Blackwell preaching the curse of Ham.
Right.
For context, this was a widespread weaponization of a biblical story from Genesis, twisted to claim that God had ordained Africans to be perpetual servants. It was preached from pulpits as undeniable truth.
A highly effective delivery mechanism for its time.
unfortunately.
Exactly. But when that stops working, the architecture steps up the abstraction ladder to coded policy. Think of the political strategist Warren Caldwell in 1968.
Sitting in his office.
Yeah, sitting in an office with a Dixon Ticonderoga pencil, testing phrases like law and order and suburban anxiety. Polling data showed explicit racial language no longer won elections, so the system adapted.
And then it adapts again. Right. Today, the architecture uses digital camouflage. You have white nationalist active clubs on Discord using sanitized terms like defending Western civilization and demographic realities. The delivery mechanism completely changes from theology to policy to algorithms, but the architecture's goal remains identical.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that attributing all of this to a single, continuous, conscious architecture overstates the system's coherence?
You think it's too much credit again?
I do. You're suggesting a 400-year continuity of intent. But history is far more fractured and chaotic than that. Let's look at the modern examples Walker uses. Take the story of Tyler Roke's father, Gary.
In Kenosha, yeah. Gary lost his job at the Kenosha Chrysler plant after working there for 27 years. Deindustrialization, the collapse of the American manufacturing base, the loss of pensions. These are distinct, complex economic phenomena driven by globalization. They aren't the products of a 400-year-old racial blueprint.
Well, Walker doesn't claim they are.
But the framework implies a level of orchestration. When Gary's son Tyler falls down a radicalization pipeline on Discord and YouTube, those algorithms are opportunistically exploiting a modern economic vacuum.
Right.
The extremists didn't engineer the plant closing in Kenosha. They just parasitically attached themselves to Gary and Tyler's genuine contemporary pain. They aren't the architects of that pain. They are opportunists taking advantage of a fractured society.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. That is a crucial distinction, but Walker explicitly addresses this. He states, the architecture doesn't create the economic pain. It harvests it.
Harvests it?
Yeah. The plant closing was a macroeconomic reality, but the physical and social geography where that harvest takes place, the environment that makes someone like Tyler susceptible to that radicalization, is absolutely architected.
How so?
Look at where Tyler grew up. Brookfield, Wisconsin. A comfortable, well-resourced suburb. But how was that suburb built? It was built on FHA guaranteed mortgages in the mid-20th century.
Redlining.
Exactly. The Federal Housing Administration literally drew red lines on maps to indicate neighborhoods where they would not insure mortgages, explicitly because Black people lived there.
Right.
So white families got government-backed wealth accumulation in places like Brookfield, while urban Black neighborhoods, like the Ward neighborhood where Darnell Oaks lived, were starved of capital and eventually destroyed by urban renewal highway projects.
The geography of inequality.
Yes. The system engineered the segregated geography that shaped Tyler's entire reality. His definition of a normal, safe neighborhood was built entirely on someone else's exclusion. So decades later, when a Discord server tells him his normal is under threat from demographic replacement, the architecture has already laid the geographical and psychological foundation for him to believe it. The algorithm didn't act alone. It used the 1936 redlining map as its base code.
Okay, I agree that the geography was engineered by those historical policies. But my deep concern is that treating the FHA mortgage policies of the 1950s and the YouTube algorithms of the 2020s as the exact same architecture creates an unfalsifiable premise.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning if everything is the architecture, then the architecture explains everything. And when a theory explains everything, it often explains nothing. We lose the ability to differentiate between a bureaucratic housing policy and an act of domestic terrorism.
I really don't think Walker loses that distinction at all. He connects them. He shows how the bureaucratic policy creates the conditions, the vocabulary, and the implicit permission structure that the domestic terrorist eventually acts upon.
But if we accept that the architecture engineers the vocabulary, harvests the pain, and creates the geography, we hit a massive wall regarding personal accountability.
Okay, let's talk about accountability.
Look at Marcus Klein, the former extremist Walker interviews. Klein describes how the movement systematically rebuilds your conscience piece by piece until a person can send death threats and still consider themselves a fundamentally good man. If the system is that powerful, what happens to free will?
That's definitely the most unsettling part of the book.
It is. Because if we view the actions of men like Robert J. Matthews, who've murdered a man in his driveway in the 1980s, or the Charleston church shooter, simply as the inevitable outputs of internet algorithms and texts like the Turner Diaries.
Just to clarify for the listener, the Turner Diaries is a 1970s dystopian novel that effectively became the blueprint for modern white nationalist terrorism.
Right, it's a vile book. But if the architecture is responsible for everything, we risk reducing mass murderers to mere victims of an ancient pipeline. Where's the space for legal and moral accountability?
I completely understand why that feels dangerous, but analyzing the system does not negate personal responsibility. Walker is very direct about this in the text. He writes, "The analysis does not replace the accountability. The analysis is the context in which the accountability operates."
Okay.
Let's look at the end of Tyler Rourke's story. Tyler is held accountable. He is arrested, arraigned, and takes a plea deal after breaking a Guatemalan immigrant's orbital bone in a Racine parking lot.
Right, he faces consequences.
Yes. Holding Tyler accountable for that violent choice does not preclude us from recognizing the 1936 redlining map, the Discord server, and the 12 men doing burpees in a park that paved his path to that exact moment. You can lock a man in a cell for his actions while still acknowledging the vast machinery that processed him.
But language matters immensely here. When you constantly refer to it as a machine, an architecture, a pipeline, the individual's choice to clench his fist and throw that punch feels secondary.
I don't think it's secondary. It's just contextualized.
But the system becomes the primary actor. And if the system is the primary actor, the moral weight shifts from the perpetrator to the blueprint. It provides a philosophical out for people doing terrible things. They can just say they were processed by history.
But the system is the primary actor in terms of scale. And we have to acknowledge that vast structural asymmetry if we ever hope to dismantle it. Walker ends the book with what I found to be the most memorable image in the entire text. He contrasts this massive architecture with what he calls the counterwager.
The Bridgeway de-radicalization program.
The community center in Milwaukee, exactly. Think about the sheer, terrifying asymmetry here. The architecture has a 400-year head start. It has endless funding through the modern attention economy.
Sure.
It has global algorithms optimizing for outrage and deeply entrenched historical precedents woven into our laws and geography. And what is the counterwager? A community center on Milwaukee's South Side with 12 folding chairs, a whiteboard, fluorescent lights, and 12-month grant cycles.
It's David versus Goliath.
That is what is fighting the machine. Acknowledging that the architecture is a massive, self-sustaining entity isn't about excusing individuals. It is the only way to understand the true scale of the work required to stop it. If we pretend this is just about individual bad apples making poor choices, we will never fund or support the counterwager at the level it actually requires. We'll keep bringing folding chairs to a wrecking ball fight.
I certainly don't disagree about the absolute necessity of funding the counterwager, but we have to look at why Bridgeway actually works.
Okay, why does it work?
The counterwager works precisely because it treats individuals as individuals, not as helpless cogs in an ancient machine. When Tyler is sitting in one of those 12 folding chairs at Bridgeway, the counselor isn't trying to dismantle a 400-year-old abstraction. She is dismantling Tyler's specific personal justifications.
Right.
To reclaim the moral agency that they surrendered to the group. If we embrace Walker's architectural framework too tightly, we risk telling people that they are entirely products of their environment, which is the exact opposite of what psychological de-radicalization requires.
But Tyler himself eventually uses the word architecture during his recovery. He says, "It's a structure. It was built. People built it. People like me operated it."
He does say that.
He reclaims his agency by recognizing the system that manipulated him. Understanding the architecture is what allows him to finally step outside of it. He finally sees that the Western civilization he thought he was fighting for was actually just a curated set of PDFs on a Discord server, specifically designed to harvest his adolescent curiosity and his father's economic pain.
And that realization is undoubtedly powerful for him, I agree. But as a historical framework, I still maintain that attributing 4 centuries of distinct actions, from pouring mustard seeds into cranial cavities in 1839 to algorithmic YouTube recommendations in 2024 to a singular, capitalized architecture, flattens the nuance of history. It creates a grand narrative that is intellectually satisfying, but historically reductive.
Well, to summarize my position as we wrap up, I think Walker's framework is absolutely essential because it forces us to look past our desire for obvious villains. It reveals that white supremacy is not an anomaly driven by monsters in hoods. It is a highly adaptable structural architecture maintained by decent professionals, textbook editors, housing appraisers, political strategists, who are simply prioritizing market share, actuarial accuracy, or political efficiency. By removing the need for malice, Walker shows us the invisible mechanics of how the system truly operates and why those 12 folding chairs are up against such an astronomical challenge.
And to summarize my stance, while the systemic forces, the redlining policies, and the historical pipelines are masterfully documented by Walker, we must remain cautious. Attributing 4 centuries of distinct historical, economic, and bureaucratic actions to a singular architecture risks flattening crucial nuance.
Right.
More importantly, it minimizes the individual moral agency required to truly confront these injustices. We cannot let the concept of a system become an alibi for the individuals who actively choose to operate it.
It leaves us with an incredibly unsettling reality. The horrific historical outcomes we read about are not always a work of evil people plotting in the dark. They are often the result of ordinary people simply doing their jobs, utilizing the tools of their trade, going home, and sleeping soundly.
Exactly. The draftsman quietly erases the load-bearing wall to save a few dollars. The foundation rots over decades, and eventually the house collapses.
We leave it to you, the listener, to explore Walker's material further and form your own conclusion on where the boundaries between systemic architecture and individual accountability truly lie. Whose hand is really holding the eraser?